You imagine empty space as nothing, a clean absence, a stage with no actors. You picture the universe as objects floating in it. Stars here, planets there, and between them, nothing. You think space is what's left over after matter is removed. You think emptiness is simple. You think it's quiet. This is the picture you carry without noticing. This is the picture your language gives you, and it feels obvious. But that picture is wrong, not slightly wrong, not metaphorically wrong, structurally wrong, because when you say empty, you are imagining a container. When you say space, you are imagining a background, and when you imagine a background, you assume it does nothing. Physics does not agree, and it never really did. You talk about space as if it were a place. You say objects are in space. You say galaxies move through space. You imagine space as something already there waiting. This feels harmless. It feels descriptive. It feels neutral, but it quietly commits you to a picture. In that picture, space is a container, a vast, invisible box. Things exist inside it, the way furniture exists inside a room. This is wrong, and the reason it's wrong is subtle enough that you rarely notice it. When you imagine a box, the box can exist without what's inside it. An empty room is still a room. A container does not depend on its contents. So, when you imagine space this way, you are assuming something powerful. That space exists independently of everything else. That it is a backdrop, a stage, a passive arena where reality plays out. Physics never actually said this. Your intuition did. The illusion comes from language. Language evolved for tables and distances and walking across fields. Not for the structure of the universe, in, out, between. These words smuggle geometry into your thinking without asking permission. But here's the uncomfortable part. If space were just a container, then removing everything inside it would change nothing about the container itself. Empty space would be the simplest possible state of reality. And yet, physics keeps finding structure where you expect absence. Not later, not as a complication, at the foundation. This should bother you, because it means the emptiness you picture has never actually existed. Even before quantum mechanics, even before modern theory, think carefully about distance. You believe distance exists even if nothing occupies it. You believe 2 points can be separated by space alone. But what defines that separation? What tells you that two things are far apart rather than close? You instinctively answer, space does. That answer assumes space is already there, already measured, already meaningful. But measurement is not passive. Separation is not free. You are using space to explain distance, and distance to justify space. That is a loop, not an explanation. The container illusion survives because it feels obvious. And obvious ideas are the hardest to question. Isaac Newton leaned into this illusion. Even he called space absolute, fixed, unchanging, always there. And for centuries, this felt correct. Until physics noticed something disturbing. The container was reacting. Distances changed depending on motion. Time refused to stay separate. Space bent. Containers don't do that. A box does not care what you put inside it. Space does. At this point, the illusion begins to crack, but not fully break. Because you're still imagining a thing that reacts, instead of asking a deeper question. What if space is not where things happen? What if space is part of what happens? That question is uncomfortable, because it removes the floor beneath your thinking. And physics is not done removing floors yet. You think reality is built from things, small things maybe. Invisible things, but still things. You imagine particles as the basic ingredients, electrons, quarks, photons, little units moving through space, and space, again, plays the role of host, a place for these things to travel. This is the intuition you start with. This is wrong, not because particles don't exist, but because they are not first. The modern picture begins somewhere that feels less solid, less comfortable. It begins with fields. A field is not a thing you can point to. It is not an object with edges. It does not sit in space like a pebble on the ground. A field is a set of possibilities. At every location, what you call a location, there are rules about what can happen there. How something would move if it were present. How it would respond if disturbed. You already accept one field without resistance, temperature. You don't ask where heat is. You ask how warm it is there. Electric and magnetic fields work the same way, but you were taught to imagine them as optional. As additions layered onto space, physics does not agree. In modern theory, the field comes first. The particle is the disturbance. An electron is not a tiny bead traveling through emptiness. It is a ripple, a localized vibration of an electron field that exists everywhere. Everywhere, even where no electrons appear. This is the moment intuition starts to fail, because now empty space already contains electron fields, photon fields, quark fields, not as objects, as structure. Space is no longer a blank canvas. It is a fabric already threaded with rules. When nothing is happening, those rules are still there. You might object, if fields are everywhere, why don't we see them? Because you are used to seeing objects, not constraints. You see motion, not permission. A violin string doesn't make sound until it vibrates. But the string is not created by the music. Likewise, a particle is not the field. It is what the field does when disturbed. This flips your hierarchy. Particles no longer explain space. Space, through fields, explains particles. This is not philosophical wordplay. It is enforced by experiments. Remove every particle from a region. Cool it, shield it, drain it. The fields remain, and this should unsettle you, because now emptiness is not empty even in principle. It is structured silence, a silence with tension, a silence that can respond. You are no longer dealing with a container. You are dealing with a system that exists whether or not you populate it. At this point, space is starting to look less like a place and more like a rule book. But there is still an intuition left to destroy. You may accept structure, you may accept fields, but you still believe nothing happens unless something is there. That belief will not survive what comes next. You still believe one thing. You believe that if nothing is present, nothing can resist you. No opposition, no response. You imagine emptiness as permissive. If something moves through it, it moves freely. If something changes, nothing objects. This belief feels reasonable. It is wrong, because empty space pushes back. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, physically. Consider inertia. When you push an object, it resists acceleration. You were taught to blame the object, its mass, its stubbornness. But mass is not just a property of the object. It is a relationship between the object and the space it occupies. This is where the discomfort begins. An object resists acceleration because changing its motion means changing how it interacts with surrounding fields. And those fields do not yield instantly, even in empty space. Even with nothing nearby, the resistance is not friction. It is not collision. It is not contact. It is coupling. You are not pushing against nothing. You are pushing against the structure of space itself. This is why inertia exists at all. If space were truly empty, no structure, no field's motion would not have meaning. Acceleration would have no cost. Nothing would define what changing motion even is. The fact that motion can resist change tells you something unsettling. Space is participating. Now consider energy. You think energy belongs to things, stored in batteries, carried by particles, released in explosions, but energy can exist without objects. Fields can store energy simply by being configured a certain way. No particles required, no matter present. Stretch a field, twist it, disturb it. You have changed the energy of empty space. This is not intuitive, because your intuition wants energy to be inside something. But space does not wait for permission to matter. Even gravity works this way. In modern physics, gravity is not a force acting through space. It is space responding to mass and energy by changing its own geometry. Mass tells space how to curve. Space tells mass how to move. That sentence is famous for a reason, because it removes the idea of a passive background completely. If space were merely a container, gravity would be something added on top of it. But gravity is the behavior of space, which means empty space already has the ability to bend, stretch, and respond. This destroys another quiet assumption. You assumed nothing could do nothing. That absence was inert, but inertia itself contradicts that. The vacuum is not a void. It is a medium with rules, stiffness, and limits. You are no longer allowed to say nothing happens there, just because no particles are present. Because something is always there, not objects, not matter, structure, and structure resists change. The next step is harder to accept, because once space can resist, it can also fluctuate, and that means emptiness is not calm. You imagine emptiness as still. No motion, no activity, no events. At most, you allow fields to exist there quietly, like a frozen lake. Present but inert. This picture is wrong, because stillness is not allowed. Even when nothing is happening, something is happening. To see why, you have to give up another comforting idea, that a system can be perfectly at rest. In everyday life, rest feels achievable. A book on a table, air that seems motionless, silence, but these are approximations, not truths. At the deepest level physics can describe, absolute calm is forbidden. Not because of noise, not because of imperfections, because of limits built into reality itself. You cannot specify everything at once. You cannot pin down a system completely, and space is not exempt. When you remove all particles, all heat, all radiation, you do not arrive at nothing. You arrive at the vacuum state, and the vacuum is not empty. It is the low, G arrangement of fields. Lowest does not mean zero. It means as quiet as allowed, and allowed is not very quiet. Fields in the vacuum fluctuate. Not as objects popping in and out, this picture is misleading, but as unavoidable variations in their configuration. You don't see these fluctuations directly, you see their consequences. Two metal plates placed close together in empty space will drift toward each other. No charge, no magnets, no particles between them. Space itself is different between the plates than outside them. That difference produces force. Nothing is doing this, the vacuum is. This is the point where language collapses. You want to ask, what is fluctuating if nothing is there? The answer is uncomfortable. The nothing is what's fluctuating, not in time like a wave on water, but in possibility. The vacuum is not a state of absence, it is a state of constraint. Certain configurations are allowed, others are forbidden, and even when nothing occupies space, those rules still have to be satisfied. So emptiness becomes restless, not chaotic, not energetic in the way explosions are, but alive with tension. This tension is not optional. You cannot remove it. You cannot cool it away. If you could turn it off, atoms would collapse. Light would behave differently. Reality would unravel. The vacuum is not a background hum you could silence. It is the hum that makes structure possible. At this stage, your old picture should be gone. Empty space is not nothing. It is not calm. It is not passive. But you may still believe something else. You may believe that with enough cleverness, enough control, physics could eventually remove even this. That true nothingness is still imaginable. Physics does not leave that door open. You may still be holding on to one escape. You may think the vacuum is noisy only because we are limited. That with better technology, deeper theory, more precision, we could drain it further. That true nothingness is still waiting at the bottom. This hope is understandable. It is wrong, because the obstacle is not practical. It is not experimental. It is not technological. It is logical. There is a limit to how empty reality can become, and that limit is not set by ignorance. It is set by consistency. At the foundation of modern physics sits an uncomfortable rule. You cannot completely freeze a system, not because things are sloppy, but because certain properties are defined only through change. To eliminate all motion, you would have to specify position perfectly. To eliminate all fluctuation, you would have to lock every field into a single value. But those statements contradict each other. This is not a failure of measurement. It is a failure of the idea that a perfectly defined state exists. The vacuum is not what remains after everything is removed. It is what remains after everything removable is removed. And even then, something remains, because fields cannot be simultaneously pinned and silent. Their lowest energy state still involves variation. Not variation in time, the way a pendulum swings. Variation in the sense that no single configuration is allowed to be exact. The vacuum is the most constrained state that still obeys the rules, and the rules cannot be bypassed. This means nothing is not a destination you could reach with enough effort. It is not hiding behind some final layer of structure. It does not exist, not as a physical state. The universe does not permit an off switch. Even if you imagined removing space itself, the idea collapses. Because without structure, there is no framework in which removal makes sense. You cannot have less than the rules that define less. This is where intuition finally gives up. Because you were taught to imagine reality as something that could, in principle, be dismantled piece by piece. Atoms into particles, particles into fields, fields into something simpler, but the chain ends not with nothing. With necessity, the vacuum is not empty because it is unfinished. It is full because it is complete. Complete in the sense that it cannot be simplified without contradiction. At this point, space is no longer a thing. It is no longer even a system you could manipulate freely. It is the minimal structure required for anything at all to exist. And now the hierarchy must flip one last time, because if space cannot turn off, then matter is no longer primary. Matter becomes secondary behavior, space becomes the condition. You were taught a story with a clear order. First, there is space, then matter appears inside it, then forces act between the pieces. This order feels natural. It is backwards. Matter does not arrive and then ask space how to behave. Matter behaves the way it does because space already has rules. Every particle you know is defined by how it interacts with fields that exist even in emptiness. Its mass, its charge, its stability, these are not internal secrets. They are agreements with space. Change the structure of the vacuum, and particles change with it. Not slightly, fundamentally. This is not speculation. Physics already treats particle properties as consequences of underlying fields. An electron is not heavy because it contains weight. It is heavy because the vacuum resists certain changes. A photon is massless not because it is special, but because the vacuum allows that behavior. Matter is a pattern the vacuum permits. This destroys another intuition. You think objects have properties and space is where those properties play out. But properties are not portable. You cannot take an electron out of space and ask what it is on its own. Outside the vacuum, the question is meaningless. This is why particles are identical, not similar, identical. Every electron in the universe has exactly the same mass and charge, because they are not individual inventions. They are repeated excitations of the same underlying structure. Space is enforcing uniformity. If particles were fundamental objects, this would be miraculous. If they are behaviors of a field, it is inevitable. Now gravity returns in a new light. Matter does not sit in space and pull on other matter across it. Matter reshapes space locally, and space tells matter how to move. The medium is not separate from the motion. It is the motion. At this stage, the old language collapses completely. There is no empty stage. There are no actors independent of it. There is only a structured background that sometimes vibrates in ways we label as particles. Space is not where matter exists. Matter is something space does. This is as far as physics can take the reversal without losing clarity. The final step is not technical, it is philosophical, because once you accept that nothing defines everything, the meaning of existence itself shifts. You started with a simple picture. Things exist, and they exist somewhere. That picture is gone. What remains is not a better version of emptiness. It is the realization that emptiness was never the opposite of existence. It was the foundation. What you called nothing is not an absence waiting to be filled. It is a set of constraints that cannot be removed. A structure that does not announce itself as a thing, yet quietly determines what things are allowed to be. This is deeply uncomfortable, because it means reality is not built from objects, but from permission, not from substance, but from consistency. The vacuum is not mysterious because it hides something. It is mysterious because it is all that must remain when explanation stops. Physics does not tell you why the vacuum has the structure it does. It tells you that without it, there would be no particles, no forces, no time, no distance. And then it stops. This is not ignorance. It is a boundary. You can keep asking why, but eventually the question loses meaning. Not because it is forbidden, but because there is nothing left to push against. You once thought the universe was full of things separated by emptiness. Now you see something quieter and stranger. A universe where nothing is active, where absence shapes presence, where the most influential part of reality is the part you never notice. This is why space cannot be ignored. This is why it cannot be treated as background, because when you remove everything else, it is still there. Not as a void, as the rule that something can exist at all. And that is the strange truth. Not that empty space is full, but that it was never empty to begin with.